Hello, class. This is Anatomy and Physiology 240, and we're talking about the skeletal tissues, chapter 11. So we're going to go through and discuss the 5 homeostatic functions of bones. We're going to list the 4 types of bones and give examples. We're going to identify the 6 major structures of a typical long bone and the parts of a flat bone. Then we're going to identify each of the major constituents of bone as a tissue and discuss how structural organization contributes to function. Then we're going to identify and name the major components of the conversion system and compare and contrast cancellous bone, which is the same as spongy bone, and compact bone. Then we're going to list and describe the functions of the 3 major types of cells found in bones. Okay, so let's start with the functions of bone. Functions of bone, I like functions, so this is going to be important to know the functions of bone. First, we have support, so the ligaments help hold bones together, and protection, movement, mineral storage, and hematopoiesis. And so bones form the framework of the body and contribute to the shape, alignment, and positioning of body parts. And then you have hard or bony boxes, if you will, that protect delicate structures inside, like the skull, the bones of the skull protect the brain. So then we have the bones with their joints constitute levers that move as muscles connect. And then bones are a major reservoir for calcium, phosphorus, other minerals. And then hematopoiesis is blood cell formation. Okay? So this is the basic skeleton, which just shows some of the basic components of the skeleton. And this just has some of the major bones, but there are 206 major bones. These are just some of them. Now here are the 5 types of bones. It's important for you to know these types of bones. You have long bones, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, and sesamoid bones. So there are 206 major bones in the body, and they're usually divided into categories based on their shape. Long bones are cylindrical. Short bones are box-like. Then flat bones are broad and sheet-like, and irregular bones, they come in various shapes. And then sesamoid bones, they look like little seeds. So here's some of the bones. And so you can take your time looking at this, but when you have A, it's coming from here. This is the humerus. And so this is how a long bone looks. And then you look at short bone, look at B, it's one of the carpal bones. And the short bone, short and boxy. Then you have irregular bones. This is an example of a regular bone. C, it's one of the vertebrae. And then D, with the flat bone, this is a sternum. And you can see that's D there, that's a sternum. Then you have E, sesamoid bones. Looks kind of seed-like. And this has the patella. You can see it's like the kneecap. And also one of the bones in the thumb. Okay. All right. Now let's look at different types of bones. And then, so we have bones vary in the proportions of 2 types of bone tissue. So we have compact bone, and then you have cancellous, is also called spongy bone. And so compact bones are very dense and they're solid. And then spongy bone is characterized by open space, partially filled with a lattice of thin structures that support soft tissue. So let's look at long bone in particular. So this is just long bone. This is not the short bone or any of the other bones. This is just the long bones. Have a diaphysis, and I need you to know that diaphysis is the main shaft of a long bone. It's hollow, cylindrical in shape, and it has thick, compact bone around it. So that's the diaphysis of a long bone. The epiphysis is on both ends of a long bone. So that's made up of, the epiphysis is made up of spongy bone filled with bone marrow. And so the function of diaphysis is to provide strong support without a whole lot of weight. And the epiphysis provides attachments for muscles, and it gives stability to joints. Here's a picture of, see the epiphysis on the end, spongy bone, and on the end, on this end. It has two epiphyses, and it has diaphysis, which is the shaft. Then we'll talk about the periosteum. Peri is around, osteum is bone. So this is a sheet-like material around the bone that actually allows muscle to, or the tendons for muscles to attach to it. You see this medullary cavity? It's an open space, as this would be hollow, except it's filled with yellow marrow. So this yellow marrow goes all the way up. And the red marrow fills in these cavities of the spongy bone. And on the end, we have this cartilage, which is called articular cartilage, because that articulating surface. But this type of cartilage is made up of hyaline cartilage. We'll talk about that as well. So here we talk about the parts of the long bone. We have the articular cartilage that we just talked about, layer of hyaline cartilage. Then we have the periosteum, dense fibrous material that covers the bone. And so it contains cells that form and destroy bone, and contains blood vessels that send branches into the bone. And so with the articular cartilage, the function is to cushion jolts and blows to the bone. And then the periosteum attaches the tendons of the muscles to the bone. It contains blood vessels as well. So periosteum is essential for bone cell survival and bone formation. Then we have the medullary cavity. That's the hollow space in the diaphysis. And in adults, it's filled with connective tissue that's rich in fat. That's why it looks yellow. And then also we have the endosteum. It's a thin membrane that lines the medullary cavity. When we look back here, so if you look at this picture, on the inside here, like this cavity, it has endosteum. And then the periosteum's on the outside. This is the medullary cavity. It's filled with yellow marrow. This is the articular cartilage, which is hyaline cartilage. And this is the red marrow is inside the spongy bone. Okay, so now let's look at the parts of the flat bone. And so we look at it, the inner portion is spongy bone covered on the outside with compact bone. So a good example of a flat bone is the cranial flat bones. They have an internal table, an external table that's compact bone, and then they have, in between those, you have the spongy bone. And they say cancellous bone, but cancellous and spongy are the same. So like long bones, the flat bones are covered with periosteum, and they're lined on the inside with endosteum. So the other flat bones and short bones and irregular bones have features that are similar to the cranial bones. So here's parts of the flat bone. This is an example of the cranial bone. And you see it has the periosteum, which is the outer covering. It has the compact bone on the outside, and it has compact bone on the inside. And then in between, sandwiched in between, is the spongy bone. And then when they talked about the periosteum covers the outside, and then on the inside of this here, you have the endosteum. So with bone tissue, the extracellular components Extracellular is outside of the cell. So outside of the bone cells, it's hard and calcified. So how rigid bone is allows it to perform its supportive and protective functions. The tensile strength of bone is nearly equal to that of cast iron, but it's less than 1/3 of the weight of cast iron. Okay. And then we have composition of bone matrix. So the extracellular matrix, this is what it's made up of. And a lot of it's inorganic salts. So you have crystals of calcium and phosphate contribute to bone hardness. That's when we talk about calcification. So calcification is part of that process that makes bones hard. That's in the extracellular matrix. Then we have the organic matrix, and it's a substance called ground substance that is a mixture that's on the outside of the cell. It's called a ground substance. And it adds to overall strength of bone and gives it some degree of resilience. Then we look at the microscopic structure of compact bone. And so it contains many cylinder-shaped structural units called osteons. That's the structural unit of the bone. So each osteon surrounds a central canal that runs through the bone and connected to transverse canals. This is what runs through there is that's where the nervous tissue, or the nerve cells, and the vascular tissue runs to give the bone its nutrition. And so here is this whole thing is an osteon, and each osteon has a central canal. That's where the blood flow and everything comes through. And each one of these small areas here, these small areas are the bone cells. Okay. Okay, and they're set in a open cavity called the lacuna. Now, the microscopic structure of compact bone, I'm actually not going to get in depth with this for each of you. Just know that the component is the osteon, the structural component, and then it has a central canal. And so nutrients are delivered and waste products are removed by diffusion through tiny caniculi. And this is in spongy bone. And so a lattice of bony branches is arranged along lines of stress to enhance the bone strength. So that's where this picture, whoops. Okay. And so as it's developing, wherever the stress is coming and hitting this bone, that's the direction that this bone will develop. And it has lattice that will go the direction of where the stress is coming from. So this bone grows in this direction. This bone up here grows up, directly up in the direction of the stress. And so bone cells receive the blood supply from the bone marrow in the internal medullary cavity of the cancellous bones. Actually, I'm not going to ask you specific questions about this. So let's start looking at some of the types of bone cells. So let's look at definitely know these three types of bone cells and what they do. The osteoblasts are small cells, and they are bone forming cells. They're found in all bone surfaces. Osteoclasts are responsible for the breakdown of bone and erosion of bone minerals. So they release the bone minerals. Then you have osteocytes. Osteocytes are mature osteoblasts. So what'll happen is this, is that this is a osteocyte, which are bigger, they break down bone. These are osteoblasts. And so these are actively producing more bone. And so what I'm going to do is get you a picture. Like this here is a osteocyte. What happens, this starts off as an osteoblast. It secretes substances that attracts calcium and phosphorus. And so on the outside of the cell, calcium, phosphorus start accumulating, and this extracellular matrix becomes calcified. So it becomes very hard. And as it secretes and puts itself in this little hole, all this stuff around it gets real hard. It becomes bone. And it gets real thick, and they can't get nutrients to the osteoblast. Then the osteoblast, when it has decreased nutrition, then it becomes inactive, kind of goes dormant. And so what happens is when it becomes dormant, it's not active, it is now called an osteocyte. Now it's an osteocyte. And this is a cartoon picture of it. It's surrounded by all this mineralized, calcified bone. And each bone cell just sits in this hollow cavity. And so they start off as osteoblasts, which are bone forming. As it forms the bone around it and it seals itself off, it now becomes an osteocyte. Okay. Now, the second part, we're going to talk about different types of bone marrow. We're going to look at the types of cartilage. We're going to look at the roles that bones play in maintaining homeostasis. And then we're going to look at the difference between the intermembranous and endochondral bone. And we're going to look at discuss the diseases of skeletal tissues. Okay, so first, the bone marrow. So we have a bone marrow is a type of soft connective tissue called myeloid tissue. Two types of bone marrow that I need you to know. One is red marrow. It functions to produce red blood cells, and actually all the blood cells. And then you have yellow marrow. There are marrow cells that become saturated with fat. So it starts off as red marrow, and then it becomes saturated with fat, and it's no longer active in blood cell formation. So the red marrow is found in virtually all the bones in an infant or child's body. The yellow marrow replaces red marrow as the individual ages. So here's a picture of the end of a bone is sliced, and so this outer covering is this articular cartilage. Which specific type of cartilage is hyaline cartilage? And then you have the spongy bone, and this is filled with red marrow, and then in the center you have the yellow marrow. Okay, and we look at the main bones in an adult that still contain red marrow include the ribs, the bodies of the vertebrae, the humerus, the pelvis, and the femur. So the yellow marrow can change to red marrow during times of decreased blood supply, such as anemia, exposure to radiation, and certain diseases. So if bone marrow is severely damaged, a bone marrow transplant can be a life-saving treatment. Now let's look at the structure of cartilage. So cartilage resembles bone in some ways. Cartilage has the flexibility of a firm plastic material, whereas bone has the rigidity of cast iron. So cartilage is an excellent skeletal support tissue in developing embryo. So developing embryo, its skeleton is made up of cartilage. So after birth, there's a decrease in the total amount of cartilage present in the body of the baby. Now let's look at the types of cartilage. You definitely need to know the types of cartilage and where they can be found, some characteristics of each of these. So you have hyaline cartilage. So it kind of looks like a milk, and it's shiny, and it kind of looks like milk. And it's found in articulating surfaces. So where bones are joined together at joints, you'll have hyaline cartilage, movable joints. Then you have elastic cartilage. They form the external ear, and it's also the epiglottis, which the epiglottis covers the opening of the respiratory tract during swallowing, and also the eustachian tubes. Then you have fibrocartilage. It has a lot of fibrous elements within its matrix, so it's very, very hard. Okay. And so here's some pictures, and this is the hyaline cartilage. It has a lot of chondrocytes, which chondro, anytime you see that, think of cartilage, and then cyte is cell. So this is the cartilage cells. You can see a lot of cartilage cells, and there's some collagen fibers, but you have a lot of cells. And so it's hard, but it's not as hard as the fibrocartilage. But you see the fibrocartilage, there's a few chondrocytes, but a whole lot of collagen bundles. This is very hard. This fibrocartilage makes up like the cartilage between vertebrae. And so when you think about and you talk about vertebral discs, they're made up of fibrocartilage. And then you have elastic cartilage, which you have the chondrocytes. So you have a few cells, but then you have a lot of elastic fibers in the extracellular matrix. And that elastic fiber makes it where it's very flexible, but still tough. And so let's look at some of the functions of cartilage. Like I said, I like functions. So functions of cartilage: sustains great weight when covering the articulating surfaces of bones. Shock absorbing pad when articulating bones of the spine. And it provides a strong yet pliable, which is like a bendable support structure, the external ear, nose, and respiratory passages. Okay. And let's look at growth of cartilage. Interstitial growth. Know that interstitial growth means that it grows in length. Grows in length. Appositional growth grows in diameter. That's what I need you to know about those. Grows in diameter. And then interstitial, it grows in length. So the regulation of blood calcium levels in the skeletal system. So the skeletal system helps maintain constancy of blood calcium levels. So during bone formation, the osteoblasts, remember we said bone forming, they remove calcium from the blood, thereby lowering the calcium circulating levels. So when osteoclasts break down bone, it releases calcium into the blood and increases the circulating level. So just remember that the skeletal system serves as a storehouse for calcium. So it stores about 98% of the body's calcium reserves. Calcium is needed for a lot of different activities in our body, and so it's very important to have plenty of calcium available. So bones have a reserve of about 98% of the body's calcium reserves. And then calcium is mobilized and moves into and out of blood during bone remodeling, either bone building, which takes calcium from the blood, or bone breakdown, which actually takes calcium, puts it back into the blood. So we look at homeostasis of the calcium ion concentration is essential for a number of things. Homeostasis means balance. So we need to have a calcium ion concentration balance for a number of reasons. One is to bone formation. Then it's needed for blood clotting, It's needed for nerve impulses to be transmitted. It's needed for muscle contraction, not just the skeletal muscle contraction, but also um, the cardiac muscle contraction. So your body puts the calcium needs, um, the metabolic calcium needs far above the storage needs of calcium. So if the blood is running low on calcium, it will very quickly start breaking down bone to take from the storage of bone to accommodate cardiac muscle contraction or nerve impulses. Okay. Okay. And then we look at how calcium homeostasis is achieved, and the primary homeostatic mechanism that regulates the calcium homeostasis is through the parathyroid gland. So when the calcium levels are low, then parathyroid hormone will actually be secreted, and it will try to increase the amount of calcium in the blood. In order to increase the amount of calcium in the blood, it needs to stimulate osteoclasts to break down bone. Remember, osteoclasts break down bone. And so when it stimulates osteoclasts to break down bone, it increases the blood calcium levels. Then it stimulates vitamin D synthesis, and it keeps the urine from peeing out calcium. Okay. And then we look at calcitonin. Calcitonin is produced by the thyroid gland, and it is released in response to too much calcium in your blood. There's too much calcium in the blood, then it stimulates bone growth by the osteoblast. So it can take calcium from the blood and store it in the bone. And then it inhibits the osteoclast activity. So if you want to look at this here, this just kind of gives, if we looked at osteoclast activity. So if you have low blood calcium level, parathyroid hormone will increase, and parathyroid hormone causes osteoclasts to break down bone. When you break down bone, calcium level in blood will rise. You get normal blood calcium levels. If you have too high of a level of calcium, then the calcitonin will decrease the osteoclast activity, so it won't break down bone, but it also increases osteoblast activity to actually make more bone, take calcium from the blood and make more bone, and therefore the calcium level in the blood decreases. Get back to normal blood levels. Okay, then we look at osteogenesis. Osteogenesis is the formation of bone. So on this, with intermembranous ossification, what I want you to know from this is I want you to know that this is how flat bones are developed. I'm not going to go in depth with intermembranous ossification, just know that this is how flat bones are developed. Then you have endochondral ossification, and endochondral ossification is how the long bones develop. And so what I want you to know with this is endochondral ossification starts with a cartilage model. Like remember I said that the embryo is all cartilage, and then it has that template that the endochondral ossification uses, that template of cartilage to calcify the cartilage and then become calcified bone. Okay. So I'm not going to get in depth with asking different things about this, other than I want you to know that endochondral ossification is what long bones use, and it uses a cartilage model or cartilage template. And then intermembranous ossification is what flat bones use to develop, and it does not use cartilage as a template. Okay, and this just shows that if you start out with cartilage, and then it starts with the diaphysis, that the cartilage becomes calcified, and then from the calcified cartilage, then it turns into bone, and you have ends of calcified cartilage, and it will move towards the ends from the diaphysis to the epiphysis until everything gets calcified. And that's where here, as you get calcified bone, and eventually the epiphysis gets all calcified, and then you get the spongy bone up here, and you get what we call an epiphyseal line, because the epiphyseal plate is how bones actually get longer, because this is full of cartilage cells. The cartilage cells divide, become more cartilage cells, and then as it takes in calcium, it calcifies. Then the calcified cartilage becomes bone, calcified bone. And so the epiphyseal plate is where the cartilage is dividing to get more and more cartilage so it can grow longer and longer and longer. Okay. And so this is just a picture of the fetal ossification. It starts in the diaphysis, and it becomes calcified going further along in the bones, the length of the bones. And it just shows as a toddler, so the ossification happens in the diaphysis of the bones first before it gets to the epiphysis. And this is a school-age child, more and more of the hand is becoming calcified. And then when you get to young adult, young adolescent, then most of the bones are calcified. Okay, and we're not going to get into the layers of the epiphyseal plate. And so know that long bones grow in length and diameter, just like we talked about with the cartilage. And this is what you need to know in terms of long bone. When they grow in length, so when they get longer, it's called interstitial growth. That's growth in length. And that's with both bone and cartilage. And when it grows in diameter, it's called appositional growth. So it gets bigger in girth. And so I'm not going to get into this. We're not going to we ran a little short with the time. This is what I want you to still know as well, though. Cycle life for skeletal tissue. Know that the skeleton is fully ossified by mid-20s. In adults, the changes occur as a result of specific conditions. So decreased density and strength result from pregnancy, nutritional deficiency, and illnesses. And then you have advanced adulthood. Then we have, you can start seeing degeneration. And so exercise can counteract some of that degeneration. Okay? And so in older adults, the hard bone matrix is replaced by softer connective tissue, results in a loss of strength and increases susceptibility to injury. So even just little light exercise can help increase the bone density and bone strength in older adults. Then we look at some of the diseases of bones. And so you have the different osteosarcoma, chondrosarcoma, the metabolic bone diseases, some diseases of bone remodeling, such as osteoporosis. Then you have rickets, which is demineralization. So minerals leave the bone due to a vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D is important with calcium homeostasis because vitamin D helps to absorb the intestines to absorb calcium. So if you have limited amount of vitamin D, you have limited amount of calcium that's going to be absorbed into your system. So what I want you to know that osteosarcomas, the most common malignant tumor of the skeletal tissue, often most fatal as well. And then know that osteoporosis is characterized by increased bone porosity. That means it's not as strong. Reduced mineral density, reduced mass. And then if you have someone that has osteoporosis, their bones fracture very easily. And then know what rickets is. Rickets, demineralization, the developing bones, if it's in young children. So even before they have skeletal maturity. All right. Just keep track of the things that I emphasized. That definitely know this, definitely know that. And you should do well on this particular exam. Make sure you still read the book, know the quick checks and why certain things that the questions ask, and I'll be pulling from those as well for the exam. All right, do well. I'll talk to you soon.